Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with A.E. Osworth presenting their new book, We Are Watching Eliza Bright, and they'll be in conversation with Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our newly expanded digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Every week we're hosting events, and our schedule appears online at our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After this introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to purchase a copy of Austin's new book. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'll also be sharing a link to donate, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have questions for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. And finally, as you may have experienced during virtual gatherings these many months, technical issues might arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. A.E. Osworth is a novelist, essayist, and storyteller who has spent nearly a decade writing all over the internet. The former geekery editor for Autostraddle, you may also be familiar with their work in Quartz, Mashable, Electric Literature, Guernica, and Paper Darts, among others. They also teach digital storytelling at the New School. They'll be joined in conversation tonight by Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, author of the Lambda Literary Award-winning, among other awards, The Fact of a Body, A Murder, and a Memoir. Their work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, and Oxford American, and they've been honored by the National Endowment for the Arts, McDowell, Yaddo, Breadloaf, as well as recognized with the Ronan Jaffe Award. In a recent piece in the New York Times, a former Googler detailed the lack of support she felt and retaliation she faced when reporting harassment at work. Even as the tech world, computer programmers, video game designers, video game players expands beyond its bro-y past, it has not been universally welcoming. In their new novel, We Are Watching Eliza Bright, Austin Osworth tells the story of a woman who stands up for herself, gets doxxed, and keeps going. Publishers Weekly says, Osworth offers a sharp take on the deeply disturbing misogyny that lurks online, as well as a hopeful look at combating it. In Harper's Bazaar, Kelly Weiss says it's unputdownable and one of the 24 books you need to read in 2021. And Crime Reads named it one of the most anticipated books of the year. And now I am so pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. Let me get them up and running. And the digital podium is now yours, Austin and Alex.
Hi, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much, Harvard Bookstore, for hosting us tonight. We Are Watching Eliza Bright is my first novel. It came out a couple of days ago, and I'm going to read from the very, very beginning of the book. So there's not one thing you need to know. Let's jump in. Normally, we wouldn't see her. On any other day, we would see only the city and its more standard occupants. Windy City, every detail of it. The buzz crackling of electricity in the power lines, the flickering neon signs on bars and lazy lights in shop windows closed for the night. The tooth-splitting bright fluorescents winking in offices 16 stories above us. Cars speeding along 4-lane drives or crawling down one-way streets. Strange public art no one asked for. Our own reflections in the building's glass windows. Sun bounces off those windows during the day, and the streetlights take over at night. A man-made jewel, always glittering. And of course, we would see each other. The city is never empty. So perhaps less like a jewel and more like a galaxy, constant motion. The bakeries are where we meet. The coffee shops and street corners, the stoops on buildings we know and those we're only dimly familiar with, the walking lanes on bridges, the docks, the old factories, the parks. We are all over every part of it. We are talking to each other, or fighting with each other, or laughing with each other, or laughing at each other. Even the most villainous among us would, in the end, choose to protect the city. If you see something, say something, and all that bullshit, well, we would say something because we love it here. It is a novel place, endless space. Normally, we wouldn't see her. She would be hidden, visible only to her friends, but then we do. And here is where we start. A shadow stalks Circuit Breaker. A tall silhouette stands out against the refracting sea of electric stars echoed in the windows. It looks like a paper doll cut from deep space. The outlined figure is where light goes to die. It is Black Hole, and we know him well, a supervillain. He punches at nothing, and she appears, falling to the ground. She is a stereotype, tall and emboobened, her figure tightly hugged by her ever-present supersuit in burgundy and black, with a shock of blonde ponytail atop her head. Her mouth is pert and perfect. She is such a stupid character. We gasp when she appears. It is like sighting a rare bird, even if she is a dumb cunt. What the shit, she says from the ground and scrambles to her feet as fast as she can. She puts her hands up, ready to fight. Electricity gathers around them, her superpower. Generic. She's angry. Good. Two others appear next to her. They are just as exciting to witness, just as rare. The first, a Black man we know as Runner Quick. Where Circuit Breaker's even curvature epitomizes symmetry, Runner foils her with his imbalanced body. His legs are massive, muscular. To understate it, he can run. He can run around the world and not even feel winded. He adjusts his goggles. His scarf blows in the wind. He is in love with the way the orange street lamp backlights it. How it glows, sound it makes as it snaps in the breeze. He knows its red silk looks great against his brown skin. He becomes aware that he is now more visible and puts his hands on his hips like he is posing for a magazine. The third figure is ugly, and she says something shrill. Now that was fucking uncalled for. What the motherboarding Christ was that about? It is Chimera the Protector. Chimera, like Circuit Breaker, is another sort of balanced creature, though she looks cobbled together by a chaotic god with no sense of aesthetics or respect for anyone who must lay their eyes upon her. Her hairy ape arms are large enough to be another set of legs. Curled up on her back like two sleeping animals rest a pair of large black bat wings. All this melds elegantly into a gold-skinned androgynous head, angular in the face, with hair as black as clear ice on tar. The result of these disparate parts of people and animals is a hero reasonably good at almost everything. Strength, flight, brains and brawn, skill points in all the right places. When it comes to beauty, she's like a taunt, unconcerned in our direction. We would rather see Circuit Breaker naked. Black Hole drops to the ground as another supervillain saunters up next to him. Dr. Moriarty. We know him well too. A perfect gentleman. His blonde hair is neatly parted and swooped as if he is an advertising executive. He wears a gray suit, a pipe peeking from his front jacket pocket. His gun, oversized and expensive, glows a brilliant green and purple. He laughs maniacally, a deep mwah-ha-ha, like he's been practicing. We start to show up in earnest now. People in nondescript suits and glasses, pencil skirts and sensible flats, librarian sweaters. Though we are dressed as our alter egos, we know each of us is a superhero or maniacal villain, every last one. We hear Chimera say, "Really, Lewis? Really?" "Suzanne," says Dr. Moriarty, "you're not supposed to use real names in game." It is not as though the illusion is shattered. There's not, if we're honest, truly an illusion. It simply is. Guilds of the Protectorate is a skin on top of our reality, a dual truth, just as real as meat space. We live in a time where almost everyone has at least two bodies, and the second life is far more thrilling than the first. We are watching Circuit Breaker get the punch to the back of the head she deserves. We are watching Eliza Bright, who is controlling this avatar from her apartment in New York City. Both are true. We clamor, we type and shout and hoot and scream, and we do it so loud that the shutter click is almost inaudible. Zoom in on one of us, the psionic private eye prone to walking through walls. He wears a trench coat and a close-cropped, high and tight haircut. In Windy City, he's known as the inspector. He doesn't carry a gun. He carries a camera with a cartoonish flashbulb. He deals in secrets, information. We know who to talk to when we need dirt on rival guilds, secret cabals, Avengers-esque, bespandecked groups. We wonder how he keeps track of it all. It can't be due entirely to his character stats. He's too fast. He appears anywhere the Fancy Dog Games employees appear, at any time of the day or night. He is always replete with facts and rumors about the company, the game itself. So many questions. Does the inspector ever sleep? Does he have a brain that catches facts and keeps them like fireflies in a jar? Does he have a wall full of photos with red string between each face? Is he perhaps actually an investigator for hire in the real world? Is he more than one person playing on the same account? We will eventually come to know exactly who he is. But for now, let's maintain the suspense. The telling is half the fun. Runner Quick says, "Y'all," and turns outward to face us. The group notices our presence, not the inspectors per se, but the truth is we don't need him tonight. We are all watching. And it dawns on each of them, even Black Hole and Dr. Moriarty, that our involvement in any fight could go either way. Maybe cool it, Runner continues. Circuit breaker drops the electricity around her fingers. Fine, she says, and the group slams the invisibility function back on. Friends only. To the rest of the world, Circuit Breaker and her cronies may as well not exist. We groan and our frustration shakes the glass and the cabs and the very sky above us. We begin to disperse, to wink into our own invisibility or to sign off. But not all of us. Never all of us. We are always here on the internet, eyes trained on our cast, on Twitter, Reddit, even in Windy City. We can find out a lot. And what we don't know, we can guess, or we can ask, or we can invent. As you heard in the first chapter, that was the first chapter. The book is narrated collectively and unreliably by players of Guilds of the Protectorate, which is the game I made up. And they are also denizens of Reddit and 4chan, the very same folks who perpetuated Gamergate, which this book is heavily, heavily influenced by, loosely based on. I'm going to read chapter 2 as well, which takes place outside the game. And then we'll get to chatting.
Sounds great.
Okay. Let's jump to the next morning. Eliza is the first one of the 3-person team to arrive. She gets in the elevator, ascends to the 5th floor, one above where she used to work in the quality assurance department. Fancy Dog takes up 2 floors in a larger office building. 3, if we count the existence of the test floor, which we aren't supposed to know about yet. Preston Waters moved his company in and renovated the shit out of that place. He transformed what was once stodgy cubicles and solid walls with cheap doors into a glass and wood open plan paradise. Now it looks clipped from a brochure for the latest, hottest startup. Perhaps because this is, in fact, the latest, hottest startup. Those few walls that exist are lined with framed art of classic superheroes, villains, and contemporary reimaginings of comics past. We are so jealous from our shitty day jobs, our challenging high-stakes careers, our school desks, and we stalk staff selfies on Twitter, repost to subreddit, swoon, what we wouldn't give to work there. Eliza is exhausted, having not slept all weekend. Fancy Dog Games has a tradition. When someone new joins a team, he picks something to do, a new feature with a pie-in-the-sky design document or an update or a fix. To keep everyone on their toes, the CEO says. Eliza is coming off the nonstop weekend of Red Bull and heavy metal coding playlists. She wants to prove herself. It doesn't matter that work is hectic. Given the confluence of holiday and the huge secret project we shouldn't know about, the one that will be announced shortly, she wasn't required to partake in this particular tradition. But here she is anyhow, having volunteered. An overcompensation for being new or self-taught or shitty at this, or the girl, or all of it. Being a hero in the hope that no one will notice ineptitude of any kind. She completed her part of a brand new feature, a massive fucking lift, in a mere 72 hours, and then stayed up late to play the very game she works so hard on. Even we acknowledge it's impressive, if compensatory for other shortcomings. She powers on her computer, a new workstation with different software and a view of the city if she turns and looks over her left shoulder, which she does and grins. She is so proud of herself. She said she'd rise in the ranks, and she is well on her way. Her first hours on the 3-person development team will be marked with a splash. She's going to kick ass at this, kick ass and take names. Or perhaps she won't even take names. She won't have the time for it. She'll be one big ball of forward motion, rocketing toward her goal, toward the reveal and release that we aren't supposed to have a clue about. She takes a deep breath, signs herself onto the server, and stares at the screen. 80085, Fleischman will fix. Below is a section that she is responsible for. Code that allows players to bone each other in the game, a feature we've requested since time immemorial. An update we'll later call the sex patch. She scrolls down and sees 80085 scattered throughout on all her code, everything she's done that weekend. There are some other comments as well in the sections that aren't hers, but only on hers does she see the mysterious code number always associated with the word fix. This is her first assignment. They'd asked her what she wanted to do, and she picked this. Already, it is borked. She is mortified. Eliza allows herself a moment to feel the sour cry feeling behind her face. Imagine a pout on her rodentish lips. When Eliza was little, about 2nd grade, she was on a class trip to the Museum of Natural History. This kid, she can't remember his name, pointed at one of the prehistoric rat skulls and started calling it Elizasaurus. She stood there looking at the rat skull with its pushed forward teeth and wanted to refute the claim somehow. But when she put her hand on her mouth to check, she found she couldn't think of anything to say. The boy wasn't wrong after all. Eliza is a 6 on her very best day. She breathes deeply, pushes the cry feeling away. She counts to 10, puts her hair up, and clicks the file open. Someone set up the text editor skin so that all her code writes hot pink on a pastel pink background. She rolls her eyes and changes it to navy and cream, still gaudy, but not pink. The code in the local copy is flawless. Oh, fuck yes, she says in a relieved hiss to no one at all. She checks GitHub. People changed it after her. There in the logs. That must be what 80085 means, she thinks, accidentally garbled during edits. We can't believe she doesn't see it, say half of us. See what? Say the other half of us. Those of us who get it make fun of those of us who don't. But for the sake of brevity, let's move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. So I'm so glad to finally get to ask you questions about this book because you stopped right at a moment that is a really clear cliffhanger. And I'll just give a little context and say that I did not know Austin particularly well when they sent me the arc for this book. And I had like 6 arcs that I was scheduled to read to blurb in that time. And I picked it up and just read the opening couple of pages thinking, okay, I'm going to read this, in a couple of months when the blurb is actually due. And instead, I read the whole thing straight through. Just finished it the next morning. I could not put it down because of all this creativity that's happening in the pages that we just heard, where we've got this collective narrator. Would you flip that? Mm-hmm. We've got this collective narrator. We've got eventually 2 collective narrators. We also have this really distinctive move, I think, where scenes from this video game, Guild of the Protectorate, are alongside what I would call or would have called until we started talking about this real life. We'll talk about that in a second. And each of them are, both kinds of scenes are taken equally seriously. They're both consequential, they're both real. And so I'm curious, let's start with that collective narration and we'll get to Gamergate in a second. When did you know, well, let's start with both. When did you know you were going to collectively narrate this novel? And when did you know that you would be doing this kind of video game scenes as real life scenes kind of move to depict what you, I think, beautifully said in that line, where the second life is always more thrilling than the first, that duality of virtual life runs alongside quote unquote real life physical space.
I knew from the jump that actually both of those things I knew from the jump that we were going to do the video game stuff. The first two scenes that I read are actually the first two scenes that I wrote, which is super unusual for me because I don't write linearly usually. But the book actually came out of an assignment in my graduate program, my MFA program at the new school. And so I started at the beginning for once. It was supposed to be a 2-page assignment. And when I had 13 pages, I handed it in. And then I kept going. And then I had 50 pages and I thought perhaps I had a book. So I knew from the jump that the video game was going to be a part of it. The collective narrator, I knew that it was going to be collectively narrated. It went through several iterations. So that's what changed over time. The original idea, they were going to like whittle down to one person, and I just didn't find it as interesting because that's not the way the internet works. The internet is this sort of like big collective hive mind brain. Of course, we all have our individual experiences of it, but it wasn't as interesting to me to explore that as it was to explore the hive mind.
So tell me about that, because the hive mind, the collective narration then makes it narrated essentially much of it is narrated by the internet. And so we have two collective narrators in the book. One of them is kind of a Reddit 4chan voice that does that moment in the opening thing where sort of we introduce a female character and then like, but we'd rather fuck the other one, is a very Reddit 4chan kind of voice where that's the only thing they can think to say about the female characters. And then the other collective narrator that comes in later is the voice of the sisterhood, a sort of queer and trans feminist collective. Mm-hmm. And with both of those, you're narrating community. And I'm curious what that process was like and whether you felt like a novel about the internet sort of had to be narrated collectively.
Oh yeah, a novel about the internet for me had to be narrated collectively. I don't think it's the only way to do it, but it is my experience of the internet is about these collectives. But I actually, like, at one point when I had drafted it like 4 or 5 times, I started to get really uncomfortable with the argument that I think I was accidentally making about community, which is, I said hive mind a couple of times. And I started to think, like, am I accidentally making the argument that communities of all sorts are hive minds? And at that moment, it was actually my editor's idea to take an entity that I had created as a character, the Sixterhood, and at one point, Eliza takes refuge in their space. And I had said in the prose that the Redditors couldn't even conceptualize what the inside of their space looked like, and it was a huge plot hole because they kept narrating. And she was like, that makes no sense. And I was like, you sure are correct. And she actually suggested that the Sixterhood narrate inside the warehouse in which they live. And it was one of those things that I had already been having that uncomfortable feeling that I was making an argument I didn't actually endorse. And then the solution presented itself in the form of this feedback, and I knew instantly that she was right. And it was a pretty late edition.
Let's back up for a second and make sure they know what it's about, because you're getting all these interesting things on the move that on the table, rather, that I think that the book does so well, moving through all these interesting iterations. So it's premised on Gamergate. What was Gamergate?
Okay, so Gamergate, the short answer to what is Gamergate is the systemic harassment and terrorizing of women in and adjacent to the game design industry. And it could be players, it could be folks making games. It was kicked off by the posting of Zoe Quinn's ex that accused them of sleeping with a journalist for coverage on their game. And the internet mob went after Zoe Quinn and not the cis male journalist. It also didn't happen, is the other thing about it. So that was the inciting incident of Gamergate that happened in 2014, and it spread. People like Brianna Wu and Anita Sarkeesian became sort of like were in the path of this raging wildfire of misogyny. And it spread even further to encompass not just folks who at the time were identifying as women, but anyone who wasn't cis, straight, white, male gamer. So that is Gamergate.
Okay, so you start Gamergate. When did you realize that how did you learn about Gamergate, and when did you realize that you were going to write a novel about Gamergate?
So I learned about Gamergate because I was geekery editor at autostraddle.com, which is a magazine by and for queer folks on the internet. And I covered nerd culture, and I was looking really, really closely at Gamergate. I actually remember covering it more than I did because I was thinking about it all the time. And when I started writing, I didn't understand that that's what I was writing about until it started coming out of me. And it came out of me because I was just so pissed. I was pissed because of two things. One, this was like actively ruining individual people's lives at the time. And the second reason I was so angry is because I have a really strong connection to the human spirit of play. And this wasn't just messing with individual folks, this was messing with the concept of play. This all is all happening ostensibly over games. And of course, it's never just games. Games make up culture in the same way that TV shows and books and political rhetoric and all sorts of things make up culture. But it was fucking with play, and that made me really mad. And so when it started coming out, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. I'm very, very angry. And I was writing essentially against Gamergate.
And against Gamergate, how you and I have talked about this, about the way that you can rage write as a writer. You can like write against something, which is sort of deeply not the way I work. And so I think I'm fascinated by the idea that you work that way. And you were trying, there's a way in which in this book, it's a deeply feminist thriller. I mean, just deeply, deeply feminist, in part because it recuperates Eliza's story. It kind of gives her a different ending, I think, than the women in Gamergate found themselves confronted with. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. So
without spoilers.
Well, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that she never quits. I actually don't think that is a spoiler at all.
So she's harassed, but she keeps going.
She keeps going.
Yeah.
And that was actually less born out of the actual narratives, the actual headlines, the actual decisions that people were making in our world, and more about the fiction interventions about Gamergate. There was this awful episode of Law and Order SVU, truly terrible, that posited like the worst ending for a woman getting harassed by Gamergate that could have actually happened, and then had her quit. And that was the first fictional intervention in this that I remember seeing, and I got more angry because fiction is a space where you can tell the truth, but you don't have to tell what happened. And so why would we not explore a different kind of choice in fiction? Why would we not explore something else to get at a deeper truth here? And they did explore a different choice, and it was the absolute darkest, worst thing they could have imagined. And I did not want to do that. I wanted to have a lot of different kinds of actions that Eliza does, but I knew from the jump that she wasn't going to quit.
And so part of what the book does in such an interesting way is it like aligns us with the Reddit and 4chan voices. And, she's in that, just in the section you read, we constantly hear verbs about watching. We constantly see people watch and size each other up and judge each other. Actually, mostly we constantly see the women be watched and sized and judged. And I'm curious, it's almost like we have this panopticon view that the collective voice recruits us all into this oppressive, constantly watching panopticon, and Eliza sort of triumphs over us too. And I'm curious about what it was like to write that collective voice, because the later collective voice gets a little lighter, but this one's pretty can be pretty dark, yet somehow you also make it fun to read, even though we're being recruited into something terrible.
I mean, we are part of it. Like, that's just true. If you're on the internet at all, you are part of this voice. But it's also not just the internet. We are all in this culture together, and we all grew up here, and we're all getting these messages at all times. Like, we have that voice inside us ourselves. And one of the things that actually writing that voice taught me was how to recognize when that was happening in my own head. So it's not just about the internet. It's
not like?
Deeply uncomfortable, but also it gives me the tools to recognize when I think a thought that I don't myself endorse. And I get to think about how to address that. When all of a sudden, when I am thinking a thought about me, that sounds like my narrators should say it, I'm like, I know that that's not actually coming from me. That's coming from the misogynistic voices that we're all getting all the time. And so how can I figure out how to diffuse that a little?
That's beautiful. And the book does that so well by bringing in a recuperative other voice, the other collective narrator, that of the sisterhood. I have to say, as someone else who we both identify as trans, both are trans, and I'm so used to hearing constantly on the god-awful parts of the internet, this sort of turfy attack at the idea that transness and feminism could even go together, to which a beautiful rejoinder is like all of queer culture, but also a beautiful rejoinder is the sisterhood you wrote in the book, which is a deeply trans and deeply feminist space. And when I was reading the sisterhood sections, I repeatedly found myself pausing to cheer, because the collective narrator would say things about experiences of identity and gender that I've never seen represented in literature before. I just have never seen a voice say that in a book before, let alone, a book from like a mainstream big five huge publisher like Grand Central. And I'm curious what it was like, at one point the sisterhood comments on a cis person whose experience of their gender matches that sex assigned at birth, and sort of says, oh, it's too bad they never had to figure out their feelings about that. And I'm like, what is such an unusual and not the way our culture commonly thinks about the experience of trans people versus the experience of cis people. And I'm just curious what it was like to then tune into that voice, which felt to me reading it like such a deeply liberated voice. Like you could say things that you are in your community that you really wanted to say, what it was like to switch to that voice after channeling Reddit for so long.
Yeah, I channeled Reddit for like 5 years before I got to channel the sisterhood. It's an interesting experience to have made the selection to do Reddit. But it makes sense to me. And I'm a little upset about it, that I didn't gravitate toward the sisterhood first, that it was such a late ad. I think about the Alexander Chee piece, I think it's in Vulture, How to Unlearn Everything. In it, he talks about writing the other, but he also talks about writing experiences that the author has as well. And community members that are closer to my experience of the world. And the sisterhood is closer to my experience. I spend most of my time with people who think and act and speak like the sisterhood. And I did not at first think to put it in, because that's not what books have in it. And thank goodness for my editor where she went, actually, that's a huge plot hole. What if the sisterhood narrates? Because then I was able to sort of back into my community's voice, which is like upsetting, but also I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do it. What I wound up doing was my editor and I got on Zoom. It was during the pandemic. We got on Zoom and we analyzed what I had done with the Reddit voice. And then I drew lines from each of them and made opposite choices for the sisterhood. So the Reddit voice speaks in these sentence fragments. The sisterhood doesn't have a single period in any of their chapters. And all of that. And when I looked down at what I had, I was like, this is how I text my friends.
Well, and what's interesting about that when you're reading it is that when you say that, oh yeah, there's no period in the chapter, it sounds like it's going to be really hard to read, but actually it's just super gripping and engrossing, and suspense is a huge part of this book. Did you set out to write a thriller, or do you just really like suspense stuff you read, or like how did that happen?
So because of the topic of it, I knew that it was going to be a thriller and that suspense was going to be a huge part of it. And that's why the chapters are what they are. The chapters are vignettes. Essentially, they're tiny, tiny chapters. And it's like M&Ms. You can't just eat one chapter.
Very true.
You have to keep going. So I knew that just because of the events of the book, that was going to be a huge part.
And some of those short chapters, I'm going to bring this up because I told you I was going to ask about this and we immediately disagreed. So, so I really want to have this conversation. Some of these short chapters involve snippets of documentation. It's sort of true to the internet that some things are emails, some things are GChat transcripts. Some of these, as we've talked about, are video game moments. There's lots of, it's almost a bit chaotic, but it also is true to our mediated sense of reality where things are hitting us all the time. And, you know, I'm a nonfiction writer, and I often think about the way documentation placed in a text nudge the reader, they remind the reader that it's nonfiction, and they remind the reader that there is a truth or what have you that is being fought over. And my experience of these snippets were so different because they were contested spaces. They were constantly coming from different voices, and our experience of reality became this layered thing that I think feels true to the internet and also to modern discourse. How did you think about documentation and including those snippets?
So the way that I originally thought of the documentation, which is why I was like, oh, it's really interesting that you found them ungrounding, because my intention with them was I have two collective unreliable narrators. And my intention with the documentation was to sort of give an unmitigated by any narrators look at what was actually happening. And I think I'm more inclined to think about it in your way now after I interviewed Kay Gabriel and Andrea Abi-Karam, who edited We Want It All, which is an anthology of radical trans poetics for Guernica. And Kay Gabriel said something about the epistolary form, which is that that she thinks that queers gravitate toward it because you have an ability to speak to someone without having to explain yourself. And GChat's emails, like, yes, it's faster, but it is essentially functioning the same way as like Jane Austen's letters in Pride and Prejudice. Like it is functioning the same exact way, it just, quicker. Without needing to like send a horse to the next town. And so now I think about it as like, oh, we are still missing stuff if it's unmitigated by a narrator, because the two people involved in the conversation, or if it's a group conversation, like the people involved in that conversation aren't explaining themselves to each other.
Absolutely. So this would be a great moment for you in the audience. Hopefully you've gotten questions come to mind as we've been having this conversation. Please, please, please put them in the chat, and I will read them to Austin, and Austin will answer them for you. But let me start it off by a question that is in the Q&A, rather. I meant put it in the Q&A. Can you talk about your personal experiences with startups or video game companies, or was the stuff about the culture at Fancy Dog, which is the company in the book, totally fabricated?
A little column A, a little column B. I worked in IT for a little while, so that was part of it. But truth be told, I osmosed a lot of the startup culture when I was covering conferences and consumer technology for Autostraddle. And it's easy to osmose because the sort of hallmarks of startup culture are almost memes at this point. There's like the dogs with uniforms. I remember the first time that I spoke with my agent, and he said that he had worked at a startup and the dogs there had uniforms. And it was not a startup that I had ever, that I'd ever interfaced with. I'd never spoken to anyone who worked there. I'd never covered anything from them before. And yet the dogs had uniforms there too. And so that was one of the memeified things. Like I think about the ping pong table. Everyone has a ping pong table, everyone has beers on tap, all things to get you to like stay at work for a really long time.
I thought that those are all.
Yeah, that's essentially
really funny to read.
Yeah. It's easy to pick up on just because it's a blatant bid for someone's time. So it's like, what is the weirdest, most ridiculous choice that could be made here? And also, everyone does it not in identical ways, but in really similar ways.
Unlike everything else in this book, it's like fun to read about and fun to think about, and then you're like, oh, the dark side, because everything in the book is so much fun to read, and then you realize, oh, there are really dark consequences to what you're reading. So for example, a major plot point in the book concerns the sex patch that Eliza steps forward to work on. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is? And like, she initially, I think, thinks it's going to be fun or make sense to have. But of course, there's a terrible dark side.
Yeah.
Let me ask about what was the research like for that stuff? Yeah.
So the sex patch research was really truly just me thinking like, what if this? Oh no. Because it's a pretty patently bad idea.
Explain what it is.
Oh, the sex patch, yes. It allows people in this massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which means everybody is sort of on a server talking to other individual players. It's not like a game that you sit at your computer and play through with a story arc. It is more like a world, an open sandbox world.
Like Animal Crossing getting really big.
Even
in the pandemic.
Even bigger than that, something
Okay.
like World of Warcraft. Where you talk with a lot of people at one time, not just like 8 of your friends. So it's even bigger, you interact with strangers. And the sex patch in the game allows players to make their characters have sex with each other. So that is what the sex patch is. And it is, it's supposed to be fun and lighthearted and something that people clamor for. And it is an absolutely like rife for harassment space. Especially when it is unthought through in that way, or if thought through, then the consequences are disregarded because it is a consumer product, and so profit is the #1 concern.
I think that leads really well to the next question. That thank you, people in the chat are putting in. So please, yes, put those questions in the Q&A. Why do you think that novels about the internet are having such a moment, and the question typer actually capitalized moment to really emphasize it, a moment right now? And I'll add that, you wrote that line about the second life always being more vivid than the first before the pandemic. And I think we all in the pandemic had that experience where like the internet life was more vivid than our quarantine lives. So why do you think novels are having such a moment?
Internet novels.
Yeah.
We live like even before the pandemic, this was true. And of course, necessarily, if they're coming out right now, people have been working on them for years. So much of our lives are lived on the internet now that we have phones in our pockets. We can be even like pre-pandemic walking around in the real world and still like connected to someone 3,000 miles away, texting. And that is, of course, a digital space as well. And I think that internet novels, like, it's interesting that we're turning to a much older art form to make sense of this like bleeding edge space that we're creating. But it makes sense to me because someone has to sit down and really analyze like what is going on here in order to translate it into something the internet is, not meant to be in here, not meant to be in a book. It's supposed to be on the internet. But you have to sit down and really analyze it. And I feel like a lot of people have gotten to like, and particularly authors have gotten to a point where they can no longer like mindlessly consume the internet because they are being mindlessly consumed by the internet. So, okay, like how do we actually break it down and figure out what the consequences are to what we're doing?
I think that leads so beautifully into the next question that someone put in the chat. Thank you. Even if Gamergate is over, do you think there is something about the nature of internet discourse that creates conditions that encourage that kind of trolling, piling on, etc.?
So of course, the answer is anonymity, that people can behave worse if their likeness is not attached to what they're doing. I don't think that's all of it. I'm pretty convinced that people behave really similarly in their lives, though perhaps quieter and perhaps hedging it almost, that what they're doing is not far off. I think that the amplification, like the speed, is one of the most like that detrimental things about internet discourse that makes things rife for harassment, because you have to get on something really fast. And so you can't critically think about it before you respond to it. You have to do it right then. And that is just an environment rife for a pile-on.
So did the process of writing this book change your own relationship to social media, video games, the internet, like any of the things you're writing about this dual positive side, dark side thing about?
I have always loved the internet and hated the internet both at the same time in equal measure. Two strong feelings in very opposite directions.
But tell us more. Tell us in what way?
In what way? I created a lot of community on the internet. I met nearly everyone who is in my physical space community now. I met because I worked on the internet, and because I engaged in queer community on the internet. And it has been the greatest blessing in my life is my community. I love the internet. Also, we've got that speed and we've got that sort of like need to constantly engage in order to remain relevant. And we've got the anonymity that makes it possible to behave really badly. And we've got, because of that speed, that hive mind like collective voice that happens on the internet. All of those are really terrible and really stressful. And the need to constantly engage with them, like I hate the internet, equal measure. What this did do is I feel like I had a much more romantic view of the internet when I started out writing this, but Gamergate was already breaking that down for me as something that I felt. And so writing it, you know, took the last brick out of the wall, but like it is not what started me taking bricks out of that romance that I had about the internet.
I love that we got this this last question here. I mean, with a couple more that we'll get to, but we just got a question about what it's been like for you as a trans non-binary person navigating the publishing world. And I know you came out in the process of writing as trans in the process of writing the novel.
Yeah.
Right? And the main character in the book, Eliza, is a cis woman. So you're writing a cis female character while at the same time you're navigating coming out as trans. And I wonder if you could speak to that and also what it's been like in the publishing world as a trans non-binary writer.
Cool. So yeah, when I started writing this, I would have sworn up and down that I was a cis woman, and I wasn't. But I still kept Eliza really intentionally as a cis woman, and as in particular a white straight cis woman, because one of the things that I'm exploring in this book, there are so many characters in it. All of them are coming to the events of it at different intersectional identities, and ostensibly, you know, white straight cis women are the safest among the marginalized. And one of the things that I was exploring with this, by keeping her, even though I was like, is this even my lane anymore? By keeping her a white straight cis woman, was that even her safety, ostensibly the safest person in the book, is conditional up until the point that she makes the men angry. And then her safety goes away. So I intentionally kept it. As for the experience in the publishing world, I've actually kind of had a great time. Everyone has had my back. My agent especially, you know, corrects when folks misgender me, and everybody has been super great. The Sixterhood voice, my editor was like, make them more your people. Yeah. Which I feel like is not the narrative one would expect, but everyone has just had my back in a really wonderful way. I've been really blessed.
I think it's really important to hear that there can be really positive experiences. Yeah, and I think there are starting to be more positive experiences. Still many problems, but many positive experiences. We're getting a couple questions about your research process. Any cool research things that you did, where the questioners points out that probably traditional means of research might not have necessarily suited this book, but did you do anything really cool? Someone else asked whether anything got left on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, so when I was deciding how the Redditors knew what they knew, one of the things that I was exploring was surveillance. which I do not recommend researching. Like, do not Google how people can look through your camera at you. You don't need it in your head. I have it in mine.
Everyone's probably Googling it right now.
Don't do it. Don't do it. I have that in my head. No one needs it in theirs. So that got left on the cutting room floor when I made the decision that they make stuff up when they don't know what's going on, because that is actually more true to my experience of the internet than any like really hardcore hacking and surveillance. Like, most people just form a parasocial relationship with the people that they are watching and speak like they know exactly what is going on in that person's life when they don't know that person at all.
So two last questions.
Okay.
One, any reading recommendations? What have you been reading lately that you really loved?
Oh gosh, well, one of the internet books, Patricia Lockwood is known as talking about this, is a completely different take on the internet. It is still fragmentary. It's even shorter. I was just talking on the podcast So Many Damn Books about this particular text. And we were discussing it almost like a poem instead of a novel, because that is how fragmentary it is. And it is a completely different look at the internet and what representing the internet in a novel could do. And I loved every second of it.
And the questioner also asked if I had any reading recommendations, and I do. It's called We Are Watching Eliza Bright by A.E. Osworth. It's amazing. It's one of my favorite books I read this year, and also I devoured it. I read it in a day and a bit. But my last question for you is, what can we expect from you next? What are you working on?
I'm working on 2 books at the same time because I'm a Gemini. And one of them is, I intended it to be a romp. So it's a coven of transgender witches fighting an artificial intelligence. I trained a Botnik keyboard to help me write the AI's dialogue so it would sound less like a person. And that's
what does that mean? You trained a Botnik keyboard?
Okay.
This goes to the research question that people wanted.
So Botnik, you can, the predictive keyboard that's like when you text on your phone?
Yeah.
And it suggests the next word. Mm-hmm. You can actually go to this website, Botnik, and train one yourself off of any corpus that you would like. Corpus is an assemblage of text. And so I put together this really toxic, terrible assemblage of text that was like all these nerd references. I had everything from the Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook to Machiavelli. And it has helped me write the lines of AI dialogue. So that one has turned out to be less of a romp than I hoped.
I imagine this was too.
Yes. And then the other one that I'm working on. The other one that I'm working on is about Satan, which is also not a romp. But really what it is deeply trans, because I am who I am when I sit down to write something. I don't get a head transplant when I sit down. And because it is also a meditation on, what it means to heal after unjust punishment, which I feel like a lot of in our particular society, trans communities experience a lot of unjust punishment. So that is
beautifully said. Beautifully said. All right. So one last time, I will just remind you to please pick up We Are Watching Eliza Bright. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Austin, for those answers. Claire, you're back?
No, thank you guys. This was amazing. Listening to the two of you speak, also just seeing 2 people in the same room after a year of pandemic is just sort of like revelatory. So thank you so much. This was like absolutely wonderful. And thank you to everyone out there in the internet land, whatever that means, whether that's the real world or not. Thank you for spending your night with us. You can learn more about and purchase Austin's book at harvard.com or via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.